I'm Steve Orlins, president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by my friend, former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, who has written an absolutely fabulous book called The Avoidable War: The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the U.S. and Xi Jinping's China. It is very easy for me to say this is a must read. Between the times that Kevin was Prime Minister of Australia, he was in Beijing, and I was having a conversation with friends one night in Beijing, and they said the former Prime Minister of Australia, Lu Cohen, Kevin Rudd, was going to come. I'd heard about Kevin previously and said, wow, this can't be true. There can't be this guy who's been Prime Minister of Australia and is fluent in China, and fluent in Chinese. Like a lot of people, I assumed that this was kind of hype. Well, Kevin sits down amongst these Chinese, and the conversation continues in Chinese. Then it was the time there was a crisis in the Diaoyudao, in the Senkaku Islands, and Kevin begins to explain in Chinese the difference between sovereignty and administration of the Senkakus, Juquan and Guanliquan. And I'm sitting there and I'm going, holy mackerel, this is not hype. This guy speaks perfect Chinese. And it told me that this was one of the rare, in fact, I would not say one of the only leaders in the Western world who can speak directly to the Chinese people and the Chinese leadership. And what this book does is it takes the experience as a Western leader and the experience of really understanding China and talks about that in the context of US-China relations. Bear in mind, there is no world leader, there's no one I have talked to who has had the experience that Kevin has had in talking with the Chinese leadership directly. The book itself is really a mesmerizing analysis of US-China relations. He says he is a realist, and in some ways, he absolutely is a realist. It's not a happy story, but it is a realistic story. I thought, as I read it, actually of de Tocqueville, who was a non-American Frenchman who came to the United States and wrote about democracy in America, because there's an analytical skill that non-Americans bring to the United States to analyze our policy apparatus, why we're making decisions. And what this book does is it explains to the reader what is going on. There are times when I look at it and I wrote in the margin, yes, gosh, but I wish it weren't so. But Kevin doesn't fall into the trap of wishing that things were one way or the other. He explains the way they are in an incredibly readable way. So what I hope is not only that everybody who watches this reads the book, but that everybody in the Biden administration and the Xi Jinping administration reads the book. But that's by way of a rather long introduction, which I normally don't do, but it's great. I feel privileged to have Kevin as a friend. And I think we as Americans should feel privileged that he has written a book which really explains what is going on and what we need to do to avoid this avoidable war. So let me start with a question, unless if you want to say something in response to my overly long introduction.
Well, Steve, you've been very generous in your introductory remarks. In terms of my Chinese language skills, as you know, they are basically alcohol fueled. And so they only improve after I've had a few drinks. And I'm sure that night we were together in Beijing, that was the case as well.
Yes.
But we both got along. But thank you to you and the extraordinary work over such a long period of time from the National Committee on US-China Relations in trying to hold a fabric of this relationship between these two countries together, despite the politics and the geopolitics of the time. But yeah, let's talk the book.
The book was completed before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Would you have, and there is a section on Russia, would you have changed anything if you had written it today as opposed to when this was completed?
I think I made the last changes to the text just before Christmas last year. And no, not a word I would change, because the analysis I present in the book in terms of Xi Jinping's priority for the Russia relationship remains valid. In fact, I think it's been borne out by events. When people, I think, somewhat romantically aspire to a Chinese mediating role, somehow equidistant between Kiev and Moscow, they don't understand the dynamics of the Xi Jinping personal relationship with Vladimir Putin, but also the state relationship with the Russian Federation, which is of deep and enduring significance to Beijing. And for those sorts of reasons, we've had this clear evidence of, as to paraphrase Mao Zedong, China leaning one way in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
Did the United States mediate a resolution to the conflict in the Mideast between Israel and Egypt?
Could they, or did they?
Did they? Did they?
Well, as you know, the Middle East is not my patch, but beyond my rudimentary familiarity with the evolution of the peace processes in the Middle East over the last half century, then sure, there were roles and opportunities for the United States back then, despite their deep affinity with the people in the state of Israel, to work out arrangements with the surrounding Arab states, not just the Egyptians, but of course the Kingdom of Jordan as well. And so it's not beyond the remit of a country leaning in one direction to nonetheless play the role of a negotiator. And I think that's the thrust, the logical thrust of your question.
Yes.
But knowing as I do the level of chemistry, some would say alchemy, in the relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin personally, the most I can see the Chinese doing is at about 5 minutes to midnight, when all else has been exhausted and the Russians have indicated that they have secured as much as they believe they can secure in eastern Ukraine, they may write in my judgment, a cameo role for the Chinese to appear to be negotiating some sort of final ceasefire. But that would be a cameo role rather than a substantive role, particularly at stages of the conflict which really matter. Xi Jinping will never do anything which would cause the Russian leadership to look askance at what Xi Jinping has secured with this, the robustness of the Russia-China relationship, reflected, as you and I have both read most recently, Steve, in that extraordinary declaration of the 4th of February, signed by the two leaders in Beijing on the eve of the Beijing Winter Olympics.
We've seen China comply with US sanctions. We've seen them even go slightly beyond US sanctions. So we've seen UnionPay reject the opportunity to step in where Visa, MasterCard, and other US credit card companies have left Russia. I'm not sure I would conclude that there is no path for the Chinese to put distance between themselves and Russia.
Well, you may prove to be right. I think, as I said before, there is, I think, the political space for a cameo role. But if there was to be a substantive role played, I would have thought that would have been played in the war's first bloodiest phase, when Vladimir Putin was on the march to take Kiev and to crush the country altogether. I think the second point, though, that you have made quite validly, Steve, is Chinese toxicity towards the prospect of being the recipient of incoming US secondary sanctions. And therefore, the Chinese, to quote the Australian poets, have been more Catholic than the Pope in adhering to the financial sanctions regime currently imposed against the Russians by the US and American allies. Because China at this stage, as you and I both know, is not in a position to independently navigate its world through the international financial system, absent full access to SWIFT and full access to the US dollar-denominated global financial system.
Yeah. The book says, and it's absolutely right on, Washington has concluded that Xi has decided to espouse his domestic political model to the rest of the developing world. That's the Washington consensus. Do you agree with it? Do you agree with the Washington consensus?
Not entirely, because there are two conflicting trends within Chinese political thinking on that question. One is what I describe as the Chinese loud and proud view, which is we have an authoritarian development model here, variously called the Beijing Consensus at an earlier point in history. More recently, China's development model, essentially one which is deeply state-centric and pays no credence to the importance of developing liberal democratic institutions domestically. So there's the loud and proud school within the Chinese political and party establishment. And then militating against that is the legion of somewhat beleaguered professional Chinese diplomats who know that this is a pathway to peril and who do not want to go in that direction at all, or being seen to be advocates / strong advocates of a particular development model in a different country. So if you read the literature in Beijing, as you and I, Steve, are paid to do, it's a divided house on that question. But more broadly, beyond the advocacy of the China development model across emerging markets around the world, I think there is a much broader phenomenon at play, which I do point to in the book, which is a high degree of Chinese active advocacy now for changing the nature of the international rules-based system, the normative concepts of the system, and not just in relation to human rights, and also broader global technical standard setting and various other technology products and the like around the world as well. And what's the organizing principle there? What I see is very much China seeking to deliver unapologetically the imprint of its national interests and, where relevant, its national values on the pre-existing institutions of global governance where it can achieve those changes, as well as setting up a parallel set of institutions themselves. But as you know, and you and I have both observed and seen this in action, the pragmatists within the Chinese foreign policy establishment are always saying, be careful what you wish for, because this international rules-based system that we've currently got has actually helped China's interests a lot in the past, particularly its access to the global trading system through Chinese accession to the World Trade Organization back in 2002.
You say in the book, which is again quite clearly correct, that China has from its early years seen the US as hostile to its ideological interests. Is that fixed in cement? Is it something that can be changed? And over time, hasn't there been swings in CCP views of the United States from really a time when it was pro-American to then shifting to anti-American, and right now that pendulum is in the furthest anti-American state as it's been in a long time?
I think there are two elements within the pendulum as seen from the Beijing perspective, Steve. One is, let me call it ideological, and the second element in the pendulum is geopolitical. On the ideological pendulum, if you go back to Mao's earliest reflections, frankly, before he was even a dominant leader of the party in the 1920s, and then you certainly look at his literature on the United States in the 1930s, wherever the United States happened to be at that stage in its support for either the KMT, indirectly the CCP, in the subsequent war against Japan in China, the bottom line is Mao's position was fairly unerring about the CCP's deep hostility to the notions of Mr. Democracy, as they used to call it, 民主先生, but also the wider remit of, let's call it, universal human rights, as then reflected in the 1948 Universal Declaration, co-drafted by Eleanor Roosevelt. So I think that's a fairly consistent set of views. The volume switch may go up and down on that internally, but it's a fairly consistent set of views. Where we've had a different set of views in the barometer, Steve, has been the change in geopolitics. And if you like, we've now entered into the final manifestations of a set of changes begun 30 years ago, with the normalization of the Soviet-Chinese border and Deng Xiaoping's meeting with Gorbachev in '89. And then back again 20 years prior to that with Nixon and Kissinger. And so the underpinning geopolitics of China leaning first to the Soviet Union, then leaning towards the United States during the period of, quote, Soviet revisionism and Soviet, quote, social imperialism, and then now leaning again to Russia geopolitically in order to leverage China's geopolitical interests against the United States in maritime East Asia in particular. I think that's generated a separate set of geopolitical factors in the evolving barometer, the evolving balance, the evolving pendulum, to use your term before, of the Beijing perception of the United States.
Like me, you know thousands of Chinese. You have thousands of Chinese friends. Aren't they by and large pro-American? Don't they by and large kind of think the United States is a force for good? And that a lot of what is going on today and what is going on over history has been reactive, that in fact they start with a predisposition of favoring the United States, and when our policies push them, they then react as anyone would react in a very negative way.
I think I've always said, and began saying this in a TED talk some years ago, when the Chinese actually give you a name for your country called Meiguo, the beautiful country, it's not a bad start, because most of the rest of us who are from the barbarian world, like we Australians, mind you, Americans and the British regard Australians as barbarians generally, but and probably correctly so. But none of the rest of us, whether it's Yingguo or Aozhou, we don't have this wonderful, as it were, linguistic opening. When people look at the United States through the Chinese prism, the name accorded this great country was the beautiful country. And I think in the evolution of the Chinese perception of the United States, it has always been qualitatively different to that of the European colonial powers, as I seek to document in some part in the book. Yep. Because whereas the United States was always keen to get the same trade access to the Chinese market and came in often on the coattails of the European colonial powers, they always had a level of reservation about what the European imperialists were up to in carving up China. And I think thirdly, the appeal of Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy in that whole period of the 20s and 30s, in the period of, let's call it peak liberalism and the Chinese political experiment under Hu Shi and those folks, frankly, it leaves a continuing positive legacy in the minds of generations and generations of Chinese intellectuals and frankly, the Chinese people more broadly. A Leninist party, however, has always had a different and dissonant view of that. And depending on who's in charge of the Leninist party at a particular time, we've seen that dialed up, dialed to neutral, or shall we say dialed down, often depending on the geopolitics.
It's so interesting that I did my thesis, my college thesis in history on the period from 1944 to 1945. And I read every day, Jiefang Bao was published in Yan'an, and I read 365 days of it. And it had become progressively more pro-American. That the stories, it was about Meiguo, and the focus was on the Mei, or it was about Zhou Jinshan, it was about Old Gold Mountain, that this was where the future was. And I concluded, there were some historians who had concluded that at that point, 1944, the US was carrying the burden in the fight against the Japanese, that Mao and Zhou and Juda and the others had decided to lean towards the United States. And it was bad policy decisions that pushed the communists to then, move to the Russians, and that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had sold Mao and Zhou and the others down the road a number of times. So I always, it kind of, because that was the first serious research I ever did, it kind of set my mind to believing China is often reactive. And that a lot of the policies that we see are reactions. In fact, the book has great sections on Taiwan, and talks about potential scenarios going forward. And I read that, I think, yes, these are all true. But what bothers me is, and you do get it at the end where you said we need to re-establish a real one China policy. A lot of what China does in these areas is reactive. And that's kind of the narrative that exists to some degree in Washington, which you absolutely accurately tell is often a false narrative.
Yeah, you're right to raise the Taiwan question. You see, the United States has no national interest alive in, shall I say, fooling around with the detail of one China policy. If the United States wants to break diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, which they established in 1979 after a protracted 7-year-long negotiation, and walk away from the formula which is outlined in the 3 communiques, well, that's a sovereign decision of the United States. But so long as you have made those sovereign decisions back then it does require a certain level of political and foreign policy discipline by the United States to ensure that you are not, as it were, fundamentally violating the precepts of the one China policy, because that can bring about unnecessary and partly avoidable reactions. At the second level, however, you know as well as I do, Steve, that the resolve to resume Chinese mainland sovereignty over Taiwan has been consistently unshakable, and that the real militating factor in China's strategic mind has been the extent to which militarily, economically, and financially they could secure that objective if political diplomacy with Taiwan in fact failed. So we're dealing with these 2 realities, what I see as a continuing resolve, accentuated under Xi Jinping, to regain sovereignty over Taiwan, and I believe he's serious about the 2049 deadline. And then secondly, the unnecessary ebbs and flows, if you like, which arise in day-to-day diplomacy from fooling around with the text of the one China policy. So these are the 2 realities within which US strategy and Taiwan policy is required to operate.
The book talks about the 10 concentric circles of Xi Jinping, and the first is really staying in power, which I agree with 100%. I think taking a military action with respect to Taiwan is the one thing which would cause the overthrow of Xi Jinping or of the Chinese Communist Party. That the number of deaths, maybe we've seen 20,000 Russian soldiers die in Ukraine. We would see there'd be zeros added to that were China to act militarily. And I worry a lot that they would, again, it's my sense that China is reactive, that when we violate the one China policy, when Tsai Ing-wen rejects the 92 consensus, then things turn bad. And we just say it's the Chinese are instigating this. Well, the Chinese are reacting to changes in policy.
Well, I think, as I said, my argument would be at 2 levels. They do react tactically to significant changes in US articulation of Taiwan policy, and certainly in terms of the granularity of what is said by Tsai Ing-wen's government, as they have for Taiwanese governments prior to 2016 as well. But at the same time, I do read the text about their resolve in terms of regaining sovereignty. I look at the pattern of China's military reorganization efforts since 2015, the combined theater operations discipline are now alive within the contracted number of military regions, informationized warfare, the priority now attached to not just on rocketry, but amphibious and maritime forces. These are not actions which, in my observation, are just going through the motions. They are there to present a series of live wire military options for the Chinese to take in a proactive form. So as I argue in the book, Steve, the challenge in the Taiwan question is not simply to leave all of this to chance, but if there is a maturity at the highest levels of diplomacy between the two governments in Washington and Beijing, harking back to the maturity I think we saw in both the Kissinger and Brzezinski period of the negotiation of the parameters of the relationship back in the 1970s, there is a way to identify the granularity of red lines around the Taiwan question, which at least reduces the risk of us tripping into crisis, escalation, and conflict and war when nobody is ready for it. And frankly, nobody particularly at this stage wants it. And I'm always haunted by the events in Sarajevo in June, July, August of 1914. When the Archduke was shot, most of the rest of the world didn't have a clue who the Archduke was. B, nobody wanted a war in 1914. C, they then regarded it as unstoppable once the mobilization processes began. And then from a minor political event in a far-flung outpost of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, we're on the road to a slaughter of 60 million people around the world. Not a good outcome. So my judgment learning from that one is, what can you do in terms of sophisticated realist diplomacy to reduce that risk? Never eliminate it, just reduce it.
That's the conclusion of the book, which is your suggestion of how to approach that. Getting back to kind of so you have part of the book on semiconductors, which is really important. But again, and you talk about Xi Jinping adopting a policy to create self-sufficiency in that. How much of that is a reaction to what the United States did by cutting off the supply of semiconductors initially to ZTE, subsequently to Huawei, and we have never restored them to Huawei and have basically forced the company to change its business model. Wouldn't we have been better off to continue to supply the Chinese? Isn't it better to have them dependent upon us for these things than to become independent? Did we force that independence, I guess, is my question.
It's a critical analytical question. If you go back to what I think was the seminal Politburo deliberation on this, Steve, which I think from memory was around about April of 2019, at the point at which the Chinese Politburo rejected Liu He's first proposal for the resolution of the US-China trade war, which Liu had negotiated with Bob Lighthizer in DC. There was a bit of a come to Jesus moment, or a come to Marx moment in the Politburo meeting at the time, when Xi Jinping led the discussion, as I'm advised, around this core proposition. And here is my paraphrase, given that I wasn't attending the meeting, and I've not yet been furnished with a verbatim transcript of the meeting. But my understanding of the meeting was that it went along the lines of, these Americans are determined to throttle our long-term economic development. They will now stop at anything, either on trade and on technology. And therefore, we need to buckle down for the next 30 years of an American strategy designed to preempt and prevent our own long-term economic evolution to become the largest economy in the world. And for those reasons, we must now, this is my paraphrase again, rehabilitate the concept of zili gengsheng, national self-reliance, and apply that across the length and breadth of China's technological and other forms of economic autonomy for the future. And that's one argument. And I think there is a lot that happened in that critical Politburo meeting to turbocharge that direction. But as you and I both know, the China 2025 strategy, which was launched in 2015, preceded that meeting by 4 years. And China's move towards autonomy in all the, shall we say, commanding heights of high technology, with semiconductors at the top through to biotech at the bottom, was very much heading in a parallel direction. So therefore, what event turbocharged which underlying trend. Until we have the full release of the Politburo document sometime in the 22nd century, we probably won't know. But I think it is, as they say in the classics in international relations theory, Steve, it always takes two to tango with these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it relates to my view that a lot of what the Chinese do is because we push them into doing it. But, you know, the book so accurately talks about the narrative that there are times I get frustrated because I would say some of this narrative is false. You know, the idea, like you have a long description of, you know, the early folks who advocated for opening of China believed it would become a democracy, that it would become part of the liberal international order. Well, I was in government. That's not the case. Never thought that was the case. We believe that it would help lift hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty. We believe that China, as part of the international system, would be a more peaceful and prosperous member of the system. But we didn't believe, I certainly did, and those of us who lived in China didn't believe that it would become a democracy. So that's part of the narrative in Washington, but it's not accurate. So much of the narrative is inaccurate. Does it frustrate you the way it does me? Or you're such a realist, you say, sorry, this is what it is. We just have to deal with reality and we can't try and change this narrative.
Well, as someone like myself who was standing in Tiananmen Square in 1989 for a week just before the tanks moved in, I've never had a misty-eyed view of the likelihood of the Chinese Communist Party saying, we just got this wrong, you know, we really should just do what Wu Shi said in the 20s and 30s and become a liberal democracy and hand over the keys to the political kingdom to an electoral process. That's not in a Leninist party's DNA, and it never has been, either under Deng, under Jiang Zemin, under Hu Jintao, or under Xi Jinping. So, and as someone who has worked as a prime minister and as a foreign minister in full partnership with successive US administrations, both Republican and Democrat, on overall China strategy, like you, I've never shared the view that we're embarked on a process which was likely to produce domestic political transformation in China of a fundamental nature, as opposed to, shall we say, an incremental liberalization of the system to create more personal space for individuals, which did occur under Deng, Jiang, and Hu more broadly, but is no longer occurring under Xi Jinping. But on the second point that you asked me, which is, does this frustrate me? I suppose I've been so long in the political and diplomatic process, Steve, that I'm never allowed to have frustrations. I'm in the business of what I describe as being a realist analyst of what I think is actually happening in the relationship, whether I believe that the factoids underpinning it are accurate or inaccurate. But to describe three things, essentially. How did the US-China relationship get to its current stage? And that's 3 or 4 chapters on the history. The second is, what does Xi Jinping actually think, and what are his core ideological and political and policy priorities? That's the 10 concentric circles you speak of, which is kind of some conceptual innovation of mine just to provide a level of coherence to foreigners trying to make sense of what China is doing in the world today. And the third is my attempt to outline a concept of managed strategic competition to reduce, not eliminate, the prospects of crisis, conflict, and war. And when people criticize it by saying, well, Kevin, aren't you just kicking the can down the road? To which I would say unapologetically, you betcha, I am kicking the can down the road. I'm really old-fashioned. I don't think war is a good thing. I kind of believe in peace, and I might be unfashionable in certain quarters these days, but war is generally a really bad idea, and it has really uncertain consequences, quite apart from the human carnage on the way through. And so therefore, if a notion such as managed strategic competition gains some purchase in both Beijing and Washington, and does enable us to get through the 2020s without falling across the tripwire and bringing on a catastrophic conflict. My judgment is that's not a bad outcome, because when we get to the 2030s, guess what? The way of thinking about these things in Washington and in Beijing may have evolved as it's evolved over the decade before. Back, if we look at the first decade of this century. So I'm all for buying time. I'm all for reducing the risk of catastrophic conflict. And to paraphrase Dunn, to think that those who come after us might actually be a bit smarter in resolving these things than we may have been in the past. Back to you, Steve.
And as you and I both know, China changes all the time, and we should not be fashioning policies that assume a static China or a static America. Well, this has given everyone a taste of what is in this book, The Avoidable War. Thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you so much for helping America understand better what is going on in China, what is going on with Xi Jinping, and what is going on in the United States. You have made an enormous contribution to the literature. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it.